start the recording, but pause it.
Having a lot of Q&A answers. So we will share our winner. And our winner is Christopher Tata. Christopher Tata, congratulations. If you could go ahead and put your email in the Q&A button chat, that would be great. And we will send a $25 Starbucks gift card your way. And so without further ado, thank you so much again for being here tonight. And we will turn it over to Dr. Weiner.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. I am going to just share my screen real quick so that we can have our presentation. And away we'll go. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist. I am an addiction specialist, and I am really, honestly, very excited to talk to you guys about this tonight, because I think that this is an issue of how do we talk to kids about media that is something that is becoming more and more and more of an issue right now. And I was looking around and just couldn't find much information about it. Honestly, this webinar came from a conversation I was having with one of the co-hosts for tonight, Barbara DeNecker from CTAD. And we were talking about this and about a blog post that I'd written about the Queen's Gambit and how it's very easy potentially for kids to look at what's going on there, even with the negative sides shown to addiction, and think, hey, maybe I could potentially use substances to enhance my life in some way or as a means to an end. And that just got, the wheels turning that we probably should talk about this, because this is something that is continuing to be more and more of a present issue. And so my hope for everyone tonight is that we can have a talk about what's going on right now in terms of media exposure, in terms of what we know in the research, and then talk about some actionable strategies that you as a parent could potentially go and use today, or when you felt comfortable doing so. I guess it's actually kind of maybe a little late for today, but in the very near future, that you leave with something valuable tonight. So my contact is on this first slide. It'll also be on the last one. I'm at aaron@weinerphd.com. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if I can be a resource. So that being said, let's dive in. And I want to start first by looking at the connection between real life and media. Because theoretically, and actually they are related, but generally what we think of is this, that media comes from real life, that people have experiences or people have ideas that are inspired in some way by maybe their imagination, maybe what they've gone through, or even if we're writing stories about the world, that the media represents the real world. But actually what we're seeing as well is that it goes in the opposite direction, and that what goes on in the media comes back and influences real life. And so in truth, what we have is something that's bi-directional, and even sometimes that's cyclic, where something may or may not be happening in real life or in someone's life or in someone's subculture. And then that gets put out into some mass media outlet that has a tremendous amount of exposure. And then that in turn is viewed by millions and millions and millions of people, which then influences them to become more of real life. And that creates a cycle, which is what we call media pressure. So media pressure is what occurs when you see something, some people, culture that you identify with, and we want to emulate them. And this is particularly true for someone who's forming their identity. Someone, for example, who's in middle school, someone who is in high school, trying to maybe differentiate themselves from their parents in some way, find their own path. And so this isn't an issue just say for substances in general, where sometimes that subculture is very appealing, or folks feel like that's a place for them to fit in if they don't easily fit into other places. But the media provides a model. And although we're going to talk today about some of the negative sides of this, it honestly can be positive or negative. I know I was struck by this Instagram post that came out a couple months back of this is Torrey Smith, the wide receiver's daughter, mimicking Kamala Harris. And so it can be a force for good as well, right? When you see something in the media, when you see something on TV that inspires you to be a better version of yourself. But it absolutely cuts in both directions. And we're going to talk about some of the negative side of this as well. We can see this effect in TV and movies and music. Video games, there was a lot of talk about video games back after Columbine, about a couple decades back, social media and YouTube. where there's figures in these areas that again might be celebrities. They might also just be a constellation of people who are much more local and known to the individual, but where you see others behaving in certain ways, doing certain things, and that makes you want to move in that direction. So media pressure can either be direct or indirect in nature. And so let's start with direct. So direct media pressure is media pressure that someone is putting onto the public on purpose. So the classic example of this is if we're talking not just about advertisements, which is of course just a clear type of media pressure, is product placement in movies, which is never, of course, an accident. So some classic examples of this are things like Ray-Bans, right, with Tom Cruise, right? He basically saved the Wayfarer brand with Risky Business, and then did the same thing for aviators with Top Gun. This again was not an accident. This was something that Ray-Ban paid a lot of money for. Same is true, of course, when you think of James Bond, you think of Aston Martins, right? This is the car that James Bond drives. And not only when we're talking about product placement, but again, when we're talking about more, I guess this technically would be more indirect pressure, but this idea of, the strong or alpha male being very James Bond-esque has actually been a considerable issue in terms of emotional adjustment and being able to function properly in life when people think that they can't ask for help. And I mean, there's a lot of things that work really well in action movies that work less well in the real world. I'd say probably more things in those movies don't work well than not. And I mean, we could go on for a while, right? Some things aren't even as iconic. You've got Duracell batteries in The Matrix, Dr. Pepper and Spider-Man, 7-Up and Friends, Sennheiser headphones. These are all very intentional, purposefully placed to provide this direct pressure. You may not even entirely be aware of it, but it is absolutely there on purpose to influence you. And then, of course, you have things like this. Social media influencers promoting vapes. This was made very famous from what Juul did when they launched. There have been lawsuits about this. There are plenty more examples, but when you've got kids on a platform and they look up to these influencers, and then these influencers are promoting vape products, what do you think is going to happen, right? It's another form of advertising, which is, again, why this is paid for, and why this is valuable to companies. Now, we also have indirect pressure, and these are the sorts of things that sometimes happen by accident, but these are not being actively promoted and pushed by some business. So examples of what this looks like would be women dressing in more traditionally masculine clothing in Annie Hall. This was seen in the fashion world as kind of like a watershed moment when things started to change in terms of fashion. We see it sometimes in vernacular, where in the late 2000s and 2010s, a lot of people were saying seriously as kind of like a sentence in and of itself, which we can trace right back to Grey's Anatomy and the millions and millions of people who watched that show. Things like the beret, and Bonnie and Clyde, another example of indirect media pressure. This was not something that was being advanced for profit, but nonetheless shaped society in a significant way. And this, even up to present day, even shows we're talking about today have this in it. When the Queen's Gambit came out, if you're not familiar, this is a show about chess and addiction, I guess, is really what it's about. Chess exploded in terms of the products that were being sold, memberships online. Google this, you can see exactly what I mean. And even a little bit sillier, the same is true for Eggo waffles and Stranger Things. One of the main characters in the show loves to eat Eggo waffles, and every time a new season of Stranger Things drops, Eggo waffle sales spike. Because of indirect media pressure. This actually was not something that was bought by them. It was just something that was indirect. Now, it doesn't have to be benign, though, and that's part of the issue and why we're having this webinar tonight, is that sometimes indirect media pressure can move kids in ways unhealthier than processed food products. And one of the first examples that I can remember recently of this that made a lot of headlines was 13 Reasons Why, and its relation to suicide. And this was something that we've actually got studies that show in both directions, but essentially after the first season of 13 Reasons Why was released, there was a spike in adolescent suicides, particularly males. But it was observed, there were a couple of case studies in individual communities. There was a larger study done on this as well. There was another study saying that might have not been the case, but this was a show about a girl who commits suicide, along with a lot of other really heavy themes. And that's really concerning, right? Like we have to pause for a second and think, when art can literally kill people, how do we handle this, and what sort of responsibility do we have to make sure that what we're trying to express and achieve doesn't cause tremendous and significant collateral damage? After that controversy occurred, as well as a study by Northwestern that found that this was really stimulating a lot of discussion and feelings amongst young people, actually, there's now a little vignette at the front of 13 Reasons Why episodes that basically warns viewers that if you're struggling with depression or thoughts of suicide, this might not be a show for you. Talking about getting help. They've launched a website, 13reasonswhy.info, for people to go to for more resources on this, to try to help ensure that they're literally not indirectly killing people with the show. But this was added later after the fact. And so this is something, again, as parents, we need to be very aware of what's coming out and talk about it. And we'll talk more about specifically what to do a little in just a couple of minutes. But it's important that we keep an eye on the media ecosystem, because there's a lot of things out there that may or may not actually be healthy in many ways for kids to watch in just a very objective sense. This is a little bit less about, this idea, about like rock and roll back in the 60s. And, there's a lot of examples of, should we, thought police, if you will, or information control, but at a certain level, when we take any moral judgments out of it, if people are dying, if people are getting hooked onto things that it may eventually kill them, that's really concerning. And so the problem, and one of the impetus of talking tonight, is we're seeing the same thing with substance use. The Truth Initiative has actually been studying this for a couple of years. And in their most recent release, where they've got data from 2019, they actually found that 73% of the top 15 shows in 2009 for the youth demographic, 15 to 24, contained depictions of smoking or tobacco products. 3 out of 4. And it actually wasn't just a little bit. The top offender here was Stranger Things, particularly season 3. It absolutely exploded in terms of how often they were depicting smoking there. You can see a number of other shows there in terms of the incident rate. On the right, you can see there in 2018, and one of their findings actually was that the amount of depictions more than doubled, from 576 incidences to 1,156. And a big part of that, of course, is Stranger Things. And actually, Netflix has responded to this. We've got a slide about that in a second. But this is something where not all of the smoking is necessary in a lot of these shows. It's something that easily could be taken out. And in a minute, we'll see why that's an issue. Not only, though, when we're talking about exposure, are we talking about just the number of incidents? Like, these weren't all in just one episode. They were present in episode after episode after episode. And this is part of the issue as well when we're talking about serialized or episodic content, is that if there's a show that features prominent substance use, or that features tobacco use, you're not just exposing yourself to this once. A young person is seeing it over and over and over and over. And so you can see there in 2019, Sex Education, 88% of episodes said something about either tobacco use on screen or tobacco products on screen. Stranger Things, 3/4 of the episodes. These are all, again, from those top 15 shows popular amongst youth, many of which are either essentially like G or TV 14, basically TV 14 or below rated, are still depicting smoking. When we know that exposure actually matters. So the number in terms of raw population that was exposed to this, and Stranger Things and Orange is the New Black are 2 of the top offenders here, for 27 million young people, in terms of how many of them watched these shows. Now, what we know about exposure to smoking, actually, and this was one of the really impactful elements of the Truth Initiative research, is that if the young people are watching this was a longitudinal, they looked at this over a year span, it tripled the likelihood, if kids were watching these shows, it tripled the likelihood that they were going to start vaping within the next year if they were watching someone smoke on screen. And that's because nicotine, right now, the delivery system of choice for kids is vaping. But what we're seeing here is that there's a very clear connection between them seeing someone smoke and them deciding that they're going to vape. Beyond that, though, what we know from other studies is that youth who vape are 4 times more likely to start smoking than youth who don't vape. Now, this is not just for TV shows as well. There's other data that was published in 2020 from 2019 data that found that 37% of new youth smoking initiation was due to exposure from movies in particular. And that amounts to 6 million new smokers. Now, this was something I was not actually as plugged into the tobacco research, honestly, until I started looking into the data and the studies for this particular presentation. But there is actually a disturbingly high amount of smokers who, at any age, who will then later in their life go on to die of smoking related causes. I have actually seen in the research I was doing up to 2/3 of people who smoke in some studies at any point in their life end up dying at end of life from tobacco related causes. This study, the one that came out in 2019, estimated it at 1/3. But what that essentially equates to is that 2 million kids are likely now to die from smoking related causes because of movies and exposure in movies, which is just absolutely mind-numbing. Like, it's just almost impossible to think about. But this is what a megaphone is about. This is what exposure, and then particularly repeated exposure, is about. And this study, this 2019 study, and this has been a series of ones that has been actually published it's updated every single year. This isn't even episodic content, right? This is movies where it's a one-shot deal, where kids see someone they respect, characters who they want to emulate, and then decide to go and pick up smoking. The pipeline with vaping and with episodic content that in particular can even be consumed quickly is very, very concerning. Now, part of our challenge here, particularly when talking with young people and adults alike, is that this idea that what people are exposed to and what was modeled for them rubs off on their behavior is not actually the popular or trendy view to take. I was looking around on YouTube for any news articles that had come out around this Truth Initiative report. And I found one that was put out by Looper, and I looked down at the comments, and this was what I saw. This was just a few of them. You can, again, look at this video for yourself and see them. But this is what people say when people even report on this sort of news. They say, I have no faith in humanity, grow up people. I watch Daredevil, you don't see me jumping on buildings and getting a law degree. People smoke, don't complain that it's on TV, get over it, it's part of the 80s. So this is far and away the most common and popular responses. That is, again, what people would see. If there's a young person looking at this news and going down to the comments, they're going to see this idea get absolutely lambasted. The problem is that it's true. And that's really rough when you've got something important and truthful in the face of just intense denialism. This is something that, not the topic for tonight, but comes up a lot around marijuana, and I speak on that topic a lot. But the court of popular opinion right now does not agree with these findings, despite the fact that we're seeing it's not even like close to, like on the edge of statistical significance. This is, 3 times more likely to start smoking, vaping rather, after viewing that's really serious, and that's really impactful. Now, it's important not just to think of exposure, but also the context in which that exposure exists. And so one archetype, essentially, that you'll see sometimes with substances in media is using them for a means to an end. This is something like in the Queen's Gambit. So for those who have not seen the show, I guess, spoiler alert, this might spoil a little bit of this show. Good show, by the way, good show, but it's TV MA, and that's something that I bring up again later. Ratings are really important, and it's not to say that kids can't get around them. Of course they can, but particularly with your kids and what they're watching, it's really important to pay attention to ratings. And actually, that is one of the takeaways from the Truth Initiative study. One of their recommendations is any depiction of smoking should only be done in, like, the show should have a TV MA rating, just straight up. Kids should not be seeing it, because we know that it leads to a certain percentage of kids getting addicted, which ultimately has very negative health outcomes on their life. So the way in Queen's Gambit that the main character uses these drugs, she basically gets hooked on to sedatives, benzodiazepines, very early in her life. And not only does it calm her down, because she has a lot of anxiety, but she also uses it to visualize chess games. It's almost like it gives her superpower. And so she takes a pill, and then she sees chess on her ceiling at night. And then she plays through games in her head. And so the issue here, right, is that this actually might mirror how adolescents use stimulants or sedatives in the real world. We all know and have heard a lot about misuse of Adderall or Ritalin, kids sharing it, using it to try to get better grades in school. And certainly one of the primary reasons why kids use substances right now is to deal with stress, to deal with depression, and to cope with feelings they're struggling to cope with on their own. So what they're looking at here is someone who is potentially doing exactly what they're doing or what they're thinking about doing, and who, even though addiction, again, there are negatives portrayed in the show, she has a lot of success in terms of the immediate results in managing those symptoms. Now, part of the issue here also with kids consuming this sort of content versus adults is they're much more likely to have the like, I could do it better idea or invincibility complex. Whereas in this, Beth's addiction takes over and causes negative harms in her life. A lot of people could look at this and say, young people, why, that wouldn't happen to me. I wouldn't do that. Or that's not going to happen to me. That's not my life. That's not how my story is going to go. And that's, of course, not how this works, right? No one uses substances thinking that they're going to get addicted just like everybody else. If you could think that way about it, if you can know exactly how things were going to turn out, we probably wouldn't have as many folks addicted to substances because they'd know what hole they were falling down. But it's much easier for kids to do that. By the way, I apologize if you hear a dog or some kids. We're working from home at night. hazard of the job. But that's something that kids could very easily think when they see the show. There's also, particularly in the Queen's Gambit, a lack of realistic consequences. And so as I was watching this show, it was very, very immediately apparent to me that she never went through any sort of withdrawal when she would kind of go on and off drugs and alcohol. Very quickly changing her behavior at times. She never went to any sort of peer support group. She never went to treatment. It was just like she had an idea and she had the will to change, and then immediately she did. And that's honestly not how it works in real life. The majority of the time when someone has a really hard set addiction, it's really tough to kick. And so the young people might look at that and think that it's easy to change, like we see Beth do. That if she decides to change, she stops and then relapses. But there's that element to it. And so again, when you have young minds who don't truly understand how addiction works and they look at this, it's very easy for them to think, well, maybe there's a utility to this. Maybe this is something, if I manage it right, if I do it better than she did, this will turn out fine for me. Now, another context in which we see substance use and its impact on kids is that of normalization. And this is something that is really an important concept in terms of risk to young people around a lot of concepts related to substances. This comes up a lot when we're talking about marijuana and how it's becoming more and more acceptable with, like here in Illinois, the legalization of marijuana. I've heard it right out of young people's mouths, well, it's legal, so it can't be that bad, or isn't it medicine? That actually gives them a permission structure to do something. And Euphoria, which is a show that came out on HBO, I think it was about a year or two ago, again, is a really concerning example of what this can do. This is another TVMA show, but again, as with many TVMA shows, young people watch it and talk about it a lot. And substance use is a central plot point in this show. It's basically portrayed, although again, this is a show where it shows consequences to that behavior. It also shows a lot of like everybody doing it, like virtually everybody in the show does it. It's almost kind of seen as like a normal part of teenage life in terms of being normal, in terms of it being edgy, rebellious. It's not, it's really, that's how it's presented. Just like, this is part of the fabric of your life when you're in high school, is that you're using lots of alcohol and that you're using lots of drugs. And sure, bad things might happen, but this is just how things go. And it's important to recognize that normalization doesn't need to be positive. It doesn't always have to be that this is normal because it's fine and it's safe and it's okay. It could just be like, this is reality, this is life. And so if that's the way you feel about it, even if you know there's some risk, it might feel very comfortable to actually emulate that in real life because it feels like your reality. Worth mentioning in this show as well, it also normalizes a lot of other really maladaptive behaviors for kids all over the place, like sexting, casual sex, soliciting sex, lying about your age, fetishized sexual violence, underage camp shows. I mean, it's a good show, but it's absolutely terrible I was mortified at the idea that young people would watch this, just to be frank with you, because there's a lot of them who I think are going to take this the wrong way. There's a quote in the very first episode, and it's worth mentioning, the pilot doesn't show nearly as much of the negative consequences of substance use as the rest of the show does. So if someone just watched one episode, they get an even more skewed view of this. But literally, this is a quote from the middle of the first show. "I know your generation relied on flowers and your father's permission, but it's 2019, and unless you're Amish, nudes are the currency of love." You know, and so like just straight up, that's what's said, and that could be speaking right to a young person. This is a show that's meant to be consumed by a certain audience that has a perspective, that knows if something's a caricature, that knows if something is being provocative for being provocative, to be provocative on purpose, to make a statement. The problem again is that you can't control who's going to watch it. From the production side, you can rate it, and they did, but once it's out there, it's out there. So again, as parents, we need to be very aware of what is out there so we can be proactive in talking about it. Now, part of what's compounded this problem recently is that streaming services have exploded during COVID. There was a 66% increase in teen viewers in March in 2020. I found slightly more recent data from Nielsen. This is from August, this graph, that you can see there that it's almost doubled in terms of the amount of weekly streaming minutes. So it's up, it was quarter two 2020, 142.5 billion minutes streamed in the United States compared to 81. And if you look on the far left, you can see there are those younger demographics. That's the black and that dark blue line. And you can see there that has grown. So I just eyeballing it, I think that's probably still about that 66% increase. So not only is that content out there, but it's being streamed at a much faster rate essentially than it was prior to COVID, where everyone was stuck inside. Now it's worth mentioning that there was at least talking the talk from Netflix around Stranger Things. So after the Truth Initiative study was released, it was so compelling in terms of how much smoking was going on in the show Stranger Things, which is absolutely aimed at kids. It's kind of like it's a TV 14 rated horror show / homage to the 80s. But there's just the characters in there just smoke all the time. One character in particular just always smoking. But after that Truth Initiative data was presented, they said that they would actually take it out of season 4, primarily take it out of season 4. We'll see if that happens. And they've also now added smoking as one of those parental advisories in the beginning of all shows that have smoking in it, so that parents can know that there's smoking in there. Because again, it looks like there's a pretty clear link between kids watching depictions of smoking to essentially following the chain to one day dying of smoking. So it's really important that people understand this. However, despite the fact that they said this back in 2019, it's been pointed out that a show that's come out since then, they took Cobra Kai, the very first episode of both seasons has smoking that probably doesn't actually have to be there. Like in the convenience store, there's Camels right behind. That's the very first episode there on the left. So this is something again where people might say one thing, companies might say one thing, but what actually happens might not measure up. And so we, again, as parents, need to be very thoughtful and active about how we help kids around these issues, because the content is out there and it's going to keep coming. And I was kicking this around, like, should we be upset at the producers of these shows, the distributors? I don't know, like I personally have mixed feelings about, should art be created that potentially could cause harm. I don't know, it got mixed feelings, right? Because clearly there's places where this can be destructive, but on the other hand, it's social commentary. It can be meant for adults. I don't know. I guess I would probably honestly fall more on the sides of the artists. But it's a question of distribution channel. But how do we make sure we keep this out of the hands of kids? I don't know if there's how we do that. And the issue here, right, is that kids, they are not stupid, but they are impressionable. They're looking for role models and forming identities. And so this was always very striking to me, that it's not even necessarily conscious when you look at something like Kobe and Michael Jordan, and how honestly their games were very, very, very similar, down to literally how they they went about playing basketball. And this wasn't on purpose, right? No one's necessarily looking to emulate someone on purpose, but it still happens. A couple of concepts that play into this are cognitive priming and situational scripts. And so what this means essentially is that when you are primed for something like, say, smoking, and you attach it to being cool, or driving a car, or hanging out with people, or drinking can be the same way. When you see all of these messages that this is what these people do, or this, if I want to be like that, this is what I have to do, then it's going to feel a lot more natural to do that when you are in those situations in real life. So it kind of primes your mind to be ready to conform to the situation, and what you've seen modeled time and time again. The other aspect of this that is really important is, what is the delta? What's the difference between a child's reality and the story? Because certainly, like, if you're a kid and none of your friends use drugs, and your parents don't use, it's not even remotely part of your life, and you see Euphoria, that's not all of a sudden going to be like, that's the real world. There's such a huge gap between those two worlds that it's going to be a lot harder to make that jump. But if you're living in a world where a lot more of that happens, where this is something that's going on in your social circles, where you've seen things close to that, and even if that's taken up to maybe like an 11, and maybe it's taken up a little bit, it's still something where the edginess, the rebelliousness, the coolness potentially of some of the characters, it speaks to you in a way that's a lot closer to your reality. We see life through our own context. That was part of what was so challenging about 13 Reasons Why. That Northwestern study found 75% of teen and young adult viewers found 13 Reasons Why very relatable. It's something that they felt like speaks to their situation, their life, their circumstances, very realistic show. And so that sort of edging, right? Where, like, if this is reality and this is the show, and they're like right near each other, that's really for a kid in particular, where that's the situation. That's where we need to be a lot more concerned, because they don't have as far of a distance to go to have a problem. So the kids who are most at risk about this, there's a few characteristics, but really the core element of this is that they hear the same message echoing across different media and mediums. So we've got a lot of research around this. This one just came out a couple of years ago, looking at the presence of vaping in hip hop imagery in particular. And again, you can Google this, read up on it, but it's something where vaping has very much permeated hip hop culture. So if that's something that you want to be part of and do, that's kind of all, that's part of the fruit basket. That's part of what you're getting when you go in that direction. But then you also, we're seeing it more and more, like we've been talking about, in movies and TV shows. You're going to start seeing this in memes that pop up on Instagram, that pop up on Snapchat. You're going to start seeing TikTok videos about vaping, about doing vape tricks. You might be seeing billboards on the side of the road. You see this all over your life. And of course, then you also see it in real life in the bathroom, right? Where this is what's going on. This is the reality of high school. When high schools are open and people are in session, is that this is what kids see. And so of course this would happen, right? This is a natural progression of being inundated with the same message over and over from people who you want to emulate. So that's the key here. And that's really what the issue is with all of this exposure in media. Beyond that, if you identify strongly with their struggles and actions, if you have a lack of knowledge about drugs, alcohol, their consequences, or some of these other potentially unhealthy behaviors, it's easier for you to potentially believe the narrative that's being presented to you in the story, because you don't have that fact-based knowledge to push back against it. If you have a permissive friendship group or other social ecosystems, this also could be the home and family environment. If they're a lot more relaxed about drugs and alcohol, you are much more likely to be impacted by that media. And then if you have past trauma or active mental health concerns as a young person, and in particular, you struggle to tell the difference between fantasy and reality, that's another area where it's very easy to slide in to this sort of behavior. When you're dealing with a lot of struggles on the inside with trauma or mental health concerns, the idea of numbing out, the idea of relief is very appealing. And one of the discriminating factors, and this came out a lot around video games in particular, when people were looking at, do violent video games cause real world violence? It seems like all the evidence we have right now points to no, it does not. However, it does influence aggressive attitudes, and in some experimental settings, some aggression in experimental settings. And so that really highlights again the fact, but then we're seeing this gap in terms of kids actually committing acts of violence in the real world. It does not seem to bleed over into there. But then if someone can't tell the difference, if someone's struggling with that, if someone has, say, a psychotic disorder combined with a lot of these other factors, that's when you've got to start being potentially worried of this exposure having more of an impact. So that being said, what can we do? So we've got we've got all of this content. It's not going to go away. What can we do as parents to help keep our kids safe from this, given that they're probably going to get exposed to it? So one of the first things that you can do is communicate your attitudes and expectations about substances clearly. We know from a lot of research that despite the fact that your teenager might push back on you a lot, there might be rebellious attitude, they might be doing a lot of things to keep you at arm's length, they do still actually, your opinions and the values that you express to them matter, and they have a tremendous impact. So this is something where if you haven't had these sorts of discussions, if you're not clear about this in your home, it's something to talk about. And by the same token, if you're looking back on it and saying, you know, I do actually have a drink every night in front of my kids when I come home, or to relax, or consistently, that's something really to think twice about potentially, because that's something that they are watching and they are far more likely to model. Set and hold boundaries. This is really, really critical as well. So you cannot control all of the exposure, but at the same time, that doesn't mean, well, the horse is out of the barn, let's just let it all go. You can actually still create barriers between your kids and exposure, because we know the more exposure someone has, the greater chances that is going to seep in, and they might eventually make that unhealthy choice. So there are a lot of digital boundaries that you could set. This is, just one example of parental controls on a phone, but in just about every streaming platform, you could set these things up. You can put digital boundaries up that some tech-savvy kids do know how to get around, but some of them, kind of like a locked door, some people can pick it, but a lot of people won't get through. The other place where you can really think about setting healthy boundaries is in their social and environmental circles. So this is sometimes harder to shape if things have already gone in a negative direction and a child is hanging out with a crowd of people using substances and who have very substance permissive attitudes. But really trying to help your kid get involved in pro-social friendship groups and enjoy those things is extremely helpful in terms of shaping their behavior. In terms of holding boundaries, this is also essential. I do parental coaching, and one of the things that I hear a lot of times is this idea that, like, my child won't give me the iPad, or they keep doing this and I can't get them to stop, as if the kids are the ones who are in control, or the parents are living in fear of the child's reaction because the child has a very flagrant reaction and then gets what they want ultimately. That is a perfect way to not actually control behavior, is to give in when someone throws a tantrum, or to show them that they have the power in the relationship. As parents, it is our job to keep our children safe until they are 18 and out of the house. Until then, that is our job. And even if they have a hard time with it, we still have to do it. I know it's easier to manage when they're 4 and throwing tantrums, but we still have to do that job because these things are not safe for them yet. We've got to do that. We still, though, do have to be really proactive about these discussions, because just because you put up this, like, say, parental controls, doesn't mean that the kids aren't going to see it, right? They can easily share phones. There's so many ways around you just shielding your own device. I mean, we cannot be naive to think that kids are not going to find this stuff. Of course they are. Again, still putting up barriers, it's an important part of the process, but we still have to talk with our kids about this, because that we cannot count on that the barriers are actually going to work. So this last one is also really important, is to not have health or healthy people be on the wrong side of incentives. Something that I see a lot with families where kids are really struggling with substances, tech addiction, these sorts of constructs, is that they get they get a lot out of those networks and those things, those unhealthy activities, those friendship groups. they actually appreciate being part of, they feel appreciated, they're parts of those groups, they're getting rewards from that behavior. And home with parents just feels tense, wrong, not aligned with their values. So their incentives are all off. They really have no reason. And the punishments that their parents give don't seem to matter to them, because either they don't, or the punishments don't actually measure up to the benefits they feel like they're getting from continuing to be involved in those behaviors in that friend group. So it's like they just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. If something is going badly in terms of a child's behavior, if something is drifting in a healthy direction, you've got to look at those incentives and make sure that there's reasons for children to behave in a healthy way. Otherwise, they're never going to do it, particularly if they feel like they're getting more out of that unhealthy group. So a key element here in terms of being able to have discussions and to shape the behavior of young people is to communicate with them effectively. And an acronym, I did not make this up, but I really like it. An acronym that I like to use to describe effective communication is communicate with love. And this is something that's adapted from the motivational interviewing literature. Love stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. So what these are, listening means active listening, this idea of seek first to understand, then be understood. You know, it's coming from Stephen Covey. Listen first. This means things like open-ended questions and reflections. So instead of just listening and then maybe responding with your own point of view, you help your child go deeper. So an open-ended question is a question that doesn't have a quick one-word yes or no answer. So these, a closed question would be, was your day at school good today? Yes, no. An open-ended question would be, what was your favorite part of your school day today? Or what was the hardest part of your day today at school? That actually elicits a larger response. So a lot of times open-ended questions start with what, how, sometimes why. Those are the sorts of questions that really get kids talking. A reflection is just when you literally say something back to someone that reflects their feeling or the content of what they've said. So if you have a child who says, you know, like I'm really struggling at school because, you know, such and such happened in my friendship group, then you just simply say back, it's so tough when your friends treat you badly, isn't it? And they'd say, yeah, and then they keep going. These are therapist tricks, by the way. These are things that we use in therapy all the time to get people to go deeper and to talk. But you want to make sure that you are an active listener, that you show someone that you're paying attention, that you're listening, and that you get them to share. Because understanding someone is critical or showing that you understand is critical in terms of your ability to really connect with them. Now, offering means how you offer your thoughts and opinions, and particularly on a subject like this, where there might be opposing views on the other side, offering in an effective way is really important. So what we use to offer when it's successful is what's called a feedback sandwich. So this starts with permission asking. So instead of just saying, here's what you should do, here's what I know because I'm older than you, or I'm your parent, or I've been through high school before, you don't say anything like that. What you do first is you ask permission and say, hey, so do you mind if I share some thoughts on this? And by doing that, by asking if you can give advice or thoughts, what you do actually is you give the child control over whether or not that advice is given. And then when they say yes, then they've asked for it. And when you ask for advice, when you basically reach out for help, which is essentially what's going on in that moment, then you are much more likely to take that advice as opposed to push back on it, because again, you've asked for it. So asking permission to start, then providing the information, and then asking for reactions and making it clear it's okay to disagree. So you share your thoughts, and then you say, so what do you think about that? Do you agree? If not, you can even explicitly say that it's okay to disagree in case the other person feels intimidated or like they can't disagree. That is the most effective way to offer guidance. Again, I'm giving away all of our therapist interactional tools here today. But if you're offering an opinion, that's how you want to do it. Now, these last two are pretty close between validating and empathizing, but the idea behind validating is simply that you are telling someone that what they're feeling is okay to feel, that they are not wrong for feeling that way. And sometimes it can be really hard to do that as adults. My kids are younger than probably most of the folks on this webinar. Mine are 6 and 4. And so sometimes their problems that seem huge are, to me, might not seem so large. Like the other day, we have these two bar stools at our kitchen island, and my 4-year-old son usually sits in one and my 6-year-old daughter sits in the other. And one day my 6-year-old daughter sat in my 4-year-old stool, and it was a problem. We're talking like meltdown. But what would not have been helpful would be to say, like, suck it up already. It's just a chair. Like that's not going to make somebody feel better, right? What actually makes them feel better is it is so frustrating that she's sitting in your chair. I know. Talk to me about how it feels when things don't go your way. And actually that strategy worked in that moment of validating and getting my 4-year-old to talk about it. That helped resolve that issue much more quickly. It reinforces self-efficacy and self-trust. And then lastly, empathizing, making sure that you can show them that you understand how they feel. Not just that you can fix it, but that you can understand how they feel. There's a great quick cartoon by Brene Brown about empathy. You can Google this. But where she talks about being in a hole with someone. So if someone's in a deep hole, they don't just want you to like tell them how to get out or where to put their hands to climb up or just like immediately throw down a ladder. They want you to come down into the hole with them and to give them a hug and to be there and to listen and to give them a chance to feel their feelings. Do that with your kids. It will actually help. Seeing someone feeling seen is like a psychological breath of fresh air. It just feels amazing. And if you reflect back on impactful conversations you've had with important people in your life, you probably can see the same thing happening. So in terms of communication, have persistence and don't get discouraged. If you don't have necessarily a close relationship with your children, it's not immediately if you start communicating with these strategies that they're all of a sudden going to turn around and spill their guts to you all the time and share what they're going through. It's going to take time, but this is how you present yourself in a way that allows someone to connect with you. And lastly, it's important to recognize that all behaviors have a purpose. Even if they seem unhealthy or counterproductive, children are getting something out of them. And again, this is something that's just central to modifying any behavior, media related or drug related or not, is understanding why the child is doing it. And what is the purpose behind it? What benefit are they getting? Because if the behavior is persisting, there's something that they're getting from it that is very powerful. And without understanding what that is, it's very hard to get a shift. So in terms of conversations to have around media in particular, you want to first and foremost encourage critical thinking. So an exercise you can actually do for any sort of show, movie, YouTube clip or channel is ask who's behind this and what's their motivation. And that's something a lot of times that people don't think about when they're consuming media, is that media was produced for there's a reason why it was made. Particularly in movies and shows, nothing is by accident. From the set to the products to the characters to the script, it's all actually meticulously crafted with different layers. Nothing's an accident. So really thinking about who's behind this, what's their motivation, what do they want something from you, particularly in the case, say, of YouTube, how does it make you feel? And do they want you to feel that way? Are you being manipulated? And sometimes that's okay, right? Movies exist to make you feel things, thrills, sadness, laughter. For comedies, that's why art in many ways just in general exists, is to make you feel something. But it's useful both to think about what does it make you feel, and is that the intention? And even, do you want to be feeling that way? And what does that mean in terms of how you relate to that content? And then for ads in particular, it can be very useful to help kids look at this as, are they actively trying, like looking at the ad, whether or not it's in print or online or a video, are they trying to link it to a lifestyle or identity? Is that an a lifestyle that you identify with? How does that ad make you feel about the product? And does it send any messages about what boys, girls, kids, adults should look like, wear, eat, drink, or act? Ads are social influence campaigns. What they're trying to do is to get people to change their behavior through the ad. And that's, again, particular to buy their product is really what they're trying to do. But a lot of times ads are just simply linking a product to a lifestyle, so that when you think like, I'm part of this group, what's the soda that group drinks? Or what's the recreational activity that they do? Or what's the brand of clothing that they wear? Companies are always jockeying for this position. And when kids know about this, it empowers them to actually decide for themselves rather than be manipulated by advertisers. This is something that I stress a lot when I do assemblies or when I speak directly to kids, is really show them through vaping advertisements, for example, what marketing at different age demographics looks like and how those ads are different. We look at a lot of different ads so they can very clearly see they are being targeted. So they can then decide if they want to play into the hands of big tobacco, of big marijuana, of whoever's trying to get them to use their products or to think more favorably of their products. So other discussion strategies to think of when we're talking about media in particular. Don't shy away from positives when talking about drug use, because it's something kids, particularly high schools, they'll know if you're just only saying the bad things. People would not use drugs and alcohol if they didn't do anything for them. They wouldn't do it. It's ultimately self-defeating, of course, right? That's why people like me have a job and why prevention agencies exist. It can absolutely cause problems in the short term, long term, and even literally end your life. But in the very short term, immediately, it can provide relief. And that's why people do it. And I think it's important to have kids understand that addiction, it's kind of like, it's not like other harmful things. I actually use this example quite a bit, that like with a hot stove, if you have a young child who touches a hot stove, they're going to get burned. They're going to pull their hand away. And maybe they'll do it one more time, but probably not beyond that. They'll learn, I touch this, I get burned. Well, substances work in a very different way. They feel good. It's like touching the stove and it feeling good. And then later down the line, you getting burned and then more and more and more burned. It's like a trap that way. And so again, we have to treat kids with enough respect to actually tell them the full truth. Otherwise, like when they taste the forbidden fruit, it's going to be really sweet and they're going to wonder why they never found out about that. And that's going to actually potentially pose more problems with them going further down into that hole than if they'd actually known from the outset, this is the whole story about this paradigm. This is what this really looks like. Scare tactics, we know from research, are not always effective. It really depends on the person. Good information is useful and important. Sometimes scare tactics are effective, but we've found moving away from that is actually helpful. You don't want to be overly flamboyant or graphic in terms of how you're describing negatives. Otherwise, young people will discount you. So really talking about, do you relate to the show and in what way? And the reason for this is to make the unconscious conscious. So if you're talking about the content that has been watched and you're asking them to engage with that, really talking to them about, do you see this in your life? Do you see this in your friend's life? Does this speak to you? And then helping them understand how the fact that that speaks to them will make them potentially even more likely to want to do it. You could even ask, is this something then where you're looking at this and saying, I'm considering that? You know, you've been working with anxiety. She's struggling with anxiety. Does this look like a good option to you? And just literally having that conversation so that it's not an unconscious process of cognitive scripting and modeling anymore. You can actually talk to them about how this works so that they can be aware and take control. Another strategy that's useful is called playing the tape forward. And this is something actually that we teach a lot in rehab programs for folks to help avoid relapses. What this is about is you don't just think about the moment when you first use, you play the tape out to the end of the line where those negative consequences occur. How you feel later in the day, if you're going to have to start lying to your parents, if there's a consequence, you actually think it all out rather than just that immediate moment. And that can help prevent you from doing it in the first place. Sharing information to help discriminate fact from fiction. This is, again, there's a lot of misinformation about a lot of topics related to substances, about vaping and marijuana in particular with young people. They may be getting other contradictory messaging very often. Things like that vaping is just like water and flavoring, which is completely untrue, or that marijuana is safe and that no one's ever died from marijuana consumption, which is not true. They might be hearing this and then believing it because it bounces around in their social media echo chambers. We have to make sure that we give them good information and we show where that's being sourced. And there's actually a lot of really great content that the groups who are hosting this webinar tonight have made that speak to that end that you can find on their website. Consider also the messenger. And this is something where sometimes you as a parent are not the best vehicle for getting a point across because you're the parent. Your attitudes matter. You should always express them. And sometimes if a peer is doing it, or if you have content that's designed to speak directly to young people, the Truth Initiative has a lot of great content around this as well. It might actually have more of an impact if they're receiving it from a different source. So consider the messenger. And then also validate that a teen social ecosystem is really challenging to navigate. This is something where issues of alcohol, of vaping, of marijuana, these are bouncing around in young people's social circles all the time. And it puts a lot of pressure on them, particularly if they're the only people not doing this. Maybe their friendship group when they were younger has drifted in this direction. Pretty much everybody's using substances. They're not comfortable with it, but they don't want to lose all their friends. It's really tough. It's a really tough situation, and making sure that you validate that is an important part of holding rapport. And then lastly, if what you're doing on your own doesn't seem to be working, don't hesitate to reach out to a therapist or a parenting coach. We've been trained to do this sort of work, both in terms of working with an adolescent alone, in terms of working in joint sessions with parents to help with truthfulness and talking about issues, or even just parenting coaching to help make sure that your approach is one that gives your child the best chance at success or recovering. Those resources are there, and it's absolutely worth using them if some of the prevention steps, or even if you're trying to help fix a problem, is not working. So we are on to the summary. I'm aware we're at the top of the hour, so I appreciate everyone's patience. I'm happy to stick around for 10 minutes or so afterwards to answer questions as well. But to sum this up, media exerts influence over culture, which has a direct impact on youth attitudes and behavior. There's just a few takeaways I really want to make sure I drive home tonight as we finish up. This is one of them. Media has consequences, and exposure to media has consequences. So as parents, we need to be aware of what's going on. We can't control the content, but we can shape engagement and their interpretation. So that's where we have to focus our efforts. We focus on what we can control. This is the part we can control. Things that you can do. You can limit exposure when you are able to do so. You are able to shape your child's social environment. You can make sure your attitudes as parents are known. You can communicate with love, active listening, offering, validating, and empathy. You can encourage critical thinking, and you can help kids understand the complete picture. So thank you so much for your time and attention tonight. I'm sorry we went about a minute over. I appreciate your patience. Please feel free to reach out to me if I can be a resource to you. weinerphd.com is my website. Find me, connect with me on social media. I am constantly pushing out articles and information on substance use, on youth prevention, clinical journal articles, news, whatever I think is important. So I'd love to connect with you there as well. So thank you again, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Aaron, so much for your time. I have been watching the questions come in, and there are quite a few very challenging questions that have come.
Okay.
But I'll limit it to about 3 questions, and I've tried to find ones that overlap a little bit and that you haven't already answered a little bit. The first one, where's the profit motive for showing so much smoking in TV and movies? Do tobacco companies still pay for that, or are they benefiting for free? And is there a way that we can expose the money and marketing behind this product placement?
My understanding is that the majority of the time, it is actually not paid for. The vast majority of the time. This is just something that's done. You know, the Stranger Things aspect of it was said that this is just historical accuracy. This is, for example, like the greatest offender of this in terms of the amount of smoking shown on screen is Stranger Things. And they're saying that they're going to take it out. So we'll see if that happens, because again, there's historical accuracy and then there's harm to kids when you have a TV-14 show. So my understanding is that there's not money behind the tobacco in TV and movies aspect of this. That's my understanding. But if I'm wrong, I'd love to be corrected.
I don't have any evidence of it, but Stranger Things mentioned Camel specifically a few times, and that made me wonder. Similarly, so there are a lot of this is showing up a lot in shows geared towards teens and children. Is there a way that they can change the rating system or give a warning to parents?
Yeah, so I mean, that is one of those things that both the Truth Initiative and this research group out of California that's doing more research on the movies and smoking in movies has been very clear about how we really, if there's smoking on screen, it should be TVMA or rated R. Just simply because if you don't do that, kids are going to see it, and a certain percentage of them, you know, everything we talked about in the presentation. Unfortunately, particularly when we're talking about movies, that directly cuts down on revenues. R-rated movies make a lot less money on average than PG-13 movies. Doesn't work exactly the same way on streaming services, but I don't know as much about the dynamics behind that rating system. I think that this is one of those things where, you know, the science behind this is pretty clear that it makes a difference. And so you'd wish that these companies would do the most responsible thing. I don't know why it hasn't happened in that way. And I couldn't really tell you why, but it's a really good opportunity to write into the companies, potentially even to talk to lawmakers about it. I don't know if there's potentially some work that could be done there more on the federal level or the FCC to try to make that more of a reality. But there's no question that it would help with public health.
And there's something to be said to take the ratings that are there very seriously. When it's rated MA for mature, they mean it.
Yeah.
And then last but certainly not least, that of the questions that we got submitted, are in all your research, were there shows that you came across that we could recommend for middle schoolers or high schoolers?
That is a really good question. There was one website I found that had a couple of thoughts about that. I don't remember what they were offhand. I know that there's some movies that I feel like do a much better job of depicting realistic consequences of substances. One that comes to mind immediately is Flight, the one starring Denzel Washington, in terms of really just the really negative repercussions and the descent into addiction. I think you're going to find more examples of accurate portrayals of addiction with maybe less of the glamorization and normalization, more of just, this is a really negative aspect in someone's life that is not helping them, that is they're trying to use to cope, but is actually backfiring in their face. That is far and away the most common experience of addiction. It's not just something that you come and go from as you please. But I don't actually have really good alternatives. I need to think about that. This, by the way, is the very first time I've ever presented on this topic. It was really a thrill to work with you guys tonight and to do this. So some of these are the first time I've gotten these questions, so I don't have the answers just right there on the tip of my tongue. Does anyone else on the panel have any recommendations for movies? Otherwise, I know I'm going to be looking into this now.
Well, something I'd like to throw in as a professional preventionist is when you're watching shows that depict even realistic, even if it's not glamorized, that kids can interpret that as a scare tactic. They think that perhaps you're sitting them down in front of this show to scare them out of using, and it must be some kind of exaggeration. They're trying to manipulate me. And to your point, what you said earlier, sometimes people feel good when they use drugs. And if you're only showing the bad things, or they perceive it as only the bad things, it might have that opposite consequence with the youth. So I'd say if you watch that with your youth, make sure to watch it with them and talk to them about it, and make sure that it's supposed to be educational and not just don't use drugs, waving a finger in their face. Lauren, would you like to share that screen? Because as we wrap up, I just wanted to show, Erin mentioned that we have several different coalitions who hosted this event. And so we wanted to let you all know who those were and what communities we serve. It's quite a bit here in this area of Illinois. We have quite a few out-of-state people registered. So you can see there which coalition falls in your, or covers your community, and if you're interested in getting involved. And also we have an evaluation that we're hoping you'd fill out there. When you close out this webinar, it should automatically come up, but you can also scan that QR code. And we would really appreciate your feedback, because as Aaron mentioned, this is the first time he's presented on this topic. We'd love to give him that feedback too, so we can continue to make this better. We saw a comment come in too that they are very thankful that this is getting talked about, and we wish that it could be talked about more. So with that said, it's the end of our evening. We've already gone over, so we do wish to be respectful of your time. And so we're going to conclude our presentation, and thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.